Fire, you wanted to ask something?
Oh, yeah. At the end of the sixth day, when it says Hashishi, Rashi says that I'm hoping I'm getting this right, that the hay was added to because he made a condition with the creation that it would last until as long as the Am Yisrael accepts the Torah.
Not as long as, on condition that.
On condition that Am Yisrael accepts the Torah.
Right.
My question is, why does Hashem have to make the condition if we believe that Hashem knows everything? Doesn't Hashem know that Israel is going to accept the Torah?
Yes, he does. But that doesn't teach you how things are related to one another. That doesn't teach you what causes what depends upon what influences what. In other words, how do I know that when the world goes on, it's because we accepted the Torah? How do I know that that's what did it? How would I know that? I just see the world going on, and I see us accepting the Torah, but I wouldn't know that they're related. But the truth is that things go deeper than that. The idea of creation is a very deep and comprehensive idea. Everything that exists has to be created. So, for example, Adam and Chava were put in the Garden of Eden, and they were given a challenge. We know what happened. They failed, and there were consequences. What would have happened had they succeeded? Is that known? Well, what would have happened is that God would have done something else. The truth is, we know what would have happened, because God, so to speak, had a contingency plan. Now your question becomes gold. Why would God need a contingency plan? We make contingency plans because we don't know what's going to happen. But since he knows what's going to happen, what would he need a contingency plan for? Answer, if he hadn't made a contingency plan, we wouldn't be able to make contingency plans. Because contingency plans wouldn't be part of the creation. So he makes a contingency plan so as to bring that concept into reality so that it's available for us, we who really need it. This is a very broad idea that applies in many, many places. Luzzatto says in The Way of God, part 2, chapters 2 and 3, he has all sorts of reasons why things happen. And then what the interest of divine providence is, why divine providence makes this happen or that happen. At the very end of chapter 3, he says, and in addition to all of that, God makes things happen as means to other events that will fulfill all the reasons that I gave you. And the question is, why does God need means? Why couldn't he set it up that every event fulfills one of the ultimate goals? One answer is because if God didn't use means to ends, we wouldn't be able to use means to ends because means to ends wouldn't have been created. There'd be no such principle as means to ends. When you understand that every feature of our world, not just having fingernails and hair follicles and earlobes, but every feature of our world, mental feature, logical feature, philosophical feature, has to be created, then that explains a lot of what God does. A lot of God's interactions are meant to reveal things to us. Another place where your question could be asked, God says to Moses on 2 occasions, they've committed this terrible sin, I'll wipe them out, and I'll make a new nation out of you. In both cases, Moses gives responses. God says, okay, I won't wipe them out. Did God change his mind? No, God didn't change his mind. God's policy is, if I get a response that makes reference to these and these features, then I won't. If I don't get that response, then I will. Now your question, but doesn't he know what response he's going to get? Of course he knows what response he's going to get, but we won't know. How do we know what the factors are that overrode the decision to destroy the Jewish people? And indeed, it's a little subtle because in the case of the golden calf, Moses gives 3 arguments and God says, okay, I won't destroy them, so I know those 3 factors prevented that disaster. In the case of the spies, where God says, again, I'm going to destroy the Jewish people, and Moses gives 3 arguments, God says, I have forgiven them according to your word, singular. Moses made 3 arguments, and God says, I've forgiven them according to your word, singular. The oral tradition tells us which one it is. So there I know Moses mounted a counter argument A, B, C, and God said A is not relevant and B is not relevant, only C is relevant. That gives me a lot of information. That for this kind of challenge, it's C that turns the trick, and the other 2 don't do the job. If God didn't provoke Moses' response and then show that because of the response he's not going to do it, and we didn't have in the oral tradition which one of the responses was the relevant response, we wouldn't know how to deal with our world. We wouldn't know what to appeal to. So all of this is designed to give us information about how God runs the world. Yeah. What else is on people's minds? Yeah.
Is it strictly forbidden to smoke cigarettes?
Yes, it is strictly forbidden to smoke cigarettes, and although the rabbinic authorities have subtle nuances of difference in formulating what the law is, I don't know a single rabbinical authority today who says it's permissible.
Let's say if you've already started smoking and
Frankly, I think then it's just like any other transgression. I don't think there's anybody on the earth who can say that he's free of all transgressions. The vast majority of us are guilty of transgressions habitually. We are people in progress, and we try to improve, and we take note of our shortcomings, and we sometimes have to set a hierarchy because we can't work on everything simultaneously. But it has to be looked square in the face. Intellectually, one has to be clear that it is wrong to smoke. It's definitely wrong to smoke. And although it might not have been wrong 50 years ago, 60 or 70 years ago, when the research was not that clear, but today the research is clear, and that being the case, even though there's one little chink in the armor, in Britain they are researching, have been for at least 10 years, something called the Churchill syndrome. Winston Churchill did everything wrong. He was overweight, he smoked cigars, he drank too much, he never exercised, and he lived to a ripe old age, and he was fully functional. The hypothesis is that some people have genetic immunity. And for them, all these bad habits won't contribute. It wasn't just luck that Churchill did all the wrong things and survived and did well until ripe old age. And so they're trying to figure out what exactly that genetic immunity is. And were they able to figure it out, so the liquor companies and the cigarette companies would be overjoyed because then they could do genetic testing and tell people, you can smoke, it's no problem, nothing's going to happen to you. But until that's done, the statistics are so overwhelming that it's simply, no one that I know is permissible. Yeah, what else is on people's minds? Yeah.
It's not quite a Torah question, it's more, the kosher butcher that I used to have in Philadelphia, they had swastikas painted all over their store. So I was talking with a friend on the phone yesterday, and when I mentioned this, like I was talking about like anti-Semitism kind of being on the rise, and he said to me, well, swastikas aren't like a symbol of like just anti-Semitism. It's like they're hating blacks, they're hating all these type of people, and like in my mind, it seems like a very, it's just it is targeting the Jewish people. How would you like combat that for someone saying no, it's referring to all these people?
Well, I would ask him for 2 cases where swastikas were put on black establishments. It ain't happening. It ain't happening. So if you go to the dictionary or to Wikipedia, and look up what the swastika and what the Nazis stood for, that's one thing. But as of now, its actual focus is on Jews because it's not being used against anybody else. Don't look at it so much as a historical or sociological symbol. Look at the actual use of it in practice. And in practice, it's only going on Jewish establishments. And there was a time when they had the KKK, which was against blacks. It was also against Jews, but it was basically against blacks. That was its focus. So it wasn't specifically or particularly anti-Semitic. It was against all sorts of minorities, but their focus was on blacks. But this particular hate campaign of the last year is definitely against Jews. It doesn't go up on non-Jewish black establishments. So
you know how it used to be like black magic in the time they mentioned that, and they said it stopped, kind of. Would you consider like drugs today to be like black magic? Is it the same kind of thing? I mean, like how would you put, like, how bad is, I mean, other than harming yourself and all that, but I'm saying experiences.
Oh, well, I guess there are two different questions here. In other words, one is, what kinds of differences in our world do these techniques make? I don't know if you could really compare them. I don't know, you're talking about black magic, or you're talking about something that we find in our sources, or you're talking about South Sea Islands, or Central Africa. I mean,
I'm saying, like,
usually those things were directed against other people. Drugs typically is something you do to yourself. Many people will find that a great difference. There are some people who think, I'm not pledging allegiance, there are some people who think that in order for there to be a crime, there has to be a victim. Nothing that you do in private for yourself can possibly be a crime. And nothing you do with somebody else, the other person is willing, can be a crime because there's no victim. So in that case, drugs typically, there are vicious use of drugs, but typically drugs are taken by the individual for his own purposes. That wouldn't be anything like.
Saying, because black magic, I don't know anything about all this, but I'm just saying, like, is there not kind of link between psychedelic drugs and black magic?
Not as far as I know.
They say it gives you a third eye, so to speak.
Black magic. Yeah, but then it wouldn't be a link with black magic. If black magic doesn't do that, so then it wouldn't be a link. No. But all the claims of what it does, was for people are utterly without foundation. And I'm very suspicious of a claim which could be proved very easily, and nobody bothers to prove it. Drugs. There's magnetotherapy, where magnets can cure all sorts of diseases and so forth and so on. You wear magnets on your knee and so forth and so on. And we know how to do double-blind experiments. It's not difficult. It's not expensive in a case like this. If they don't bother to do it, then they're hiding something. Blue-green algae from the Great Lakes. That can cure everything, cancer and rheumatism and memory loss and whatever you like. Okay, it's a stuff. What do you do with it? You rub it on yourself, or you eat it, or whatever it is. Double-blind experiments are not difficult to do. And if you don't do them, then I'm suspicious that's why all these alternative medical techniques, many of them, I would say all of them, but many of them, I'm suspicious so they simply don't do the double-blind. And sometimes when you do them, you see that they work. Acupuncture as a means of anesthesia is demonstrated. It definitely works. Experiments have been done, and we know that, and it's far less invasive than drugs, and therefore it may very well be preferable. You have to take into account suggestion. I saw a short film of two doctors who went to the South Sea Islands to observe voodoo medicine. Voodoo medicine has dolls, stick pins in dolls, and they also do something called external surgery. External surgery works like this. The person comes in with a terrible pain in his stomach, and the voodoo doctor makes a few passes over his stomach, and then suddenly, plop, there's a piece of meat right on his stomach. He has taken out the diseased part of the person's insides without doing an incision. So the two doctors were observing this, and of course, it's up his sleeve, right? So of course they say, could we examine this diseased organ? He says, no, unless you bury it right away, the cure won't work. So that's how he covers himself. So after all of this, party games, they asked these two doctors, why then do people believe it? And they said, I'll tell you why. First of all, 70% of all complaints that people bring to doctors go away by themselves. They'll go away by themselves. 10% will actually be cured through the placebo effect. Placebo effect means that if you trust it, if you believe in it, it will cure you. Not you'll think you're cured, and not that it was psychosomatic in the first place. Your blood counts will change. Your muscle responses will change. That actually has an effect on the body. So they go to these voodoo doctors, 4 times out of 5, they end up healthy, well, without pain. Is any medical system perfect? No. So as I say, 4 times out of 5, we're getting our money's worth. You don't establish the effectiveness of any remedy by counting how many people who take the remedy feel better at the end? You evaluate the effectiveness of the remedy by comparing the remedy against the null hypothesis. What happens if you do nothing? There was a wonderful study, and this goes back a long time, about psychological counseling for students on campus. That's not relevant to anybody here, but you might know somebody. And what they did was, on a certain campus, they took students who applied for counseling, and they divided them into 3 groups arbitrarily. One group got to see a university psychologist. One group was sent to faculty members of other disciplines who were not psychologists. They said, the psychologists' schedules are full. Go see the history professor. Go see the mathematics professor. And 1/3 were told they put on a waiting list because there were no services available. A year went by, and they assessed all 3 groups for remission of symptoms, and they all had the same rate of remission of symptoms. That was really a damning report, because it means the psychologists didn't do any better than the historians, and the historians didn't do any better than nothing. So that's the way you assess the effectiveness of remedy. You compare it against where you don't do the remedy and see if it does any better. And you have to do it with double-blind testing. And if you do that, you have good reason to think that it really accomplishes something. So any suggested therapy which doesn't do that, I want to see the double-blind testing. Yeah. Was noch, yeah.
We hear a lot about different problems that the Jewish community is facing. One of them is assimilation. I wonder if the Rabbi knows about the historical trend. Was it always increasing, or what's the history of this?
Of assimilation?
Of assimilation, because it looks to me that it's just going up, and has it always been like that? Because it seems to me that back in Eastern Europe, in the shtetls, it was not as severe.
Okay, there's a little bit to say about this. First of all, I don't know if your description of the current situation is exactly accurate. If you divide the Jewish population into 2 groups, the group of people who pledge allegiance to the Torah and to the mitzvos. They say the Torah is true, it was given by Moses, and the mitzvos are binding, God exists, and God has commanded them. That's one group. And the other group denies that. In practical terms, the group denies it is conservative and left, and the first group is Orthodox to the right. The experience of the 2 groups is vastly different. The conservative to the left is rapidly disappearing. It's rapidly assimilating. The group to the right is exploding in population, exploding. There have been 3 censuses taken, 1990, 2000, and 1 taken recently, and they all show the same trend. So, although we do lose some percentage, it's far, far smaller than our reproduction and those who are attracting, and our population is growing tremendously. So it can't say that it's just a picture of steady drain out through assimilation. That's not true. It depends on which group you're looking at. Now, you talk about the shtetl in Europe. The last 250 years, there has been a steady drain out, a steady growth in assimilation, to the extent that after the First World War, a rough estimate is that half of Europe's Jews were not frum. They were not religious. Rabbi Meiselman, one of my teachers, told me he saw the records of the Vilna mikveh and compared it with the Jewish population of Vilna at the time, and it was quite small. The big cities were worse. The countryside was not as bad, but you had Yiddish theater, and you had Zionism, and you had socialism and communism. You had a lot of defection from our camp. In the medieval Islamic areas, many of the great Jewish classics were written in Arabic. They were written in Arabic because if you write them in Hebrew or in Aramaic, the masses of Jews wouldn't be able to read it. They wouldn't be able to read it. Maimonides' commentary in the Mishnah, let alone the Moreh Nevuchim, which is written really for the intelligentsia. But the commentary of the Mishnah has in it long essays on very elementary matters. because there was a whole population of people who at least had the interest but didn't have the capacity to deal with it. Europe was less. Europe, as I know, there was nothing written in the vernacular at all. So it varied. There's no question that in times of less persecution, there's a certain drain outward. But it's not uniform. Around the year 1900, in the Soviet Union, well, it wasn't Soviet Union, yes, it was Russia, there were about 3 million identified Jews. 3 million Jews with strong identities. Some were religious and some weren't religious, but they were all strong Jewish identities. Communism lasted for about 70 years. Today, if you can find 300,000, that's a lot. That means 90% were lost. 90% were lost. In less than a century. Through persecution. It was active, direct persecution. So sometimes it's persecution that leads to widespread assimilation, and sometimes it's relaxing of the barriers, an invitation to join the non-Jewish society that leads to widespread assimilation. I don't know enough about thousands of years of historical trends to trace them. I will point out that when the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom, about 100 years before Babylon, conquered Judea, the 10 tribes were taken off and almost all of them were lost. So that was a majority of the Jewish population who in one generation simply were lost. They were assimilated and lost. So we've been through this before. This is not the first time that we've been through this. I don't know if there could be a general theory of how it happens. In part, it's directed by divine providence. But I don't think we should be frightened by the possibility or probability of the disappearance of the Jewish people. There are very few controlled experiments in history, but we are one of them. Jewish people and its Torah have been in existence for 3,300 years. And I think it's fair to say that we have been through every conceivable kind of historical circumstance. Fabulous success and terrible degradation and conquest and denial, acceptance, rejection, and we have survived. If history has any lesson, it is that we're not in danger of disappearing. The tragedy is that so many individual Jews get lost. That in itself is a tragedy. But I don't think we have to worry that Judaism is going to disappear. Not to mention the fact that God promised us we won't disappear. So, but if one needs historical confirmation, 3,300 years of Jewish history make that quite clear, I think.
What can you say to someone like a Jewish guy who's just completely tells himself or believes that the world came into existence through a big bang and not through Judaism, through God?
Well, really, your question is a psychological question, not a logical question. But and it's going to depend upon the person's character and his psychology and what his commitments are and how open-minded he is to hear what you have to say. But the very first thing I would ask him is, why do you believe that? Why do you believe that? You have a reason for believing that?
And if he says yes, and I've looked into it, and
please share it with me. Share it with me. You've looked into it, you have sources. Give me footnotes, places to read, page numbers. Not just names of books, which he took off the atheist website, but page numbers that I should read, or copy them and send them to me, so that I can look at them, I can learn them, and maybe we can discuss them. I guarantee you, he will have no reasons. He takes that position because it's the chic, popular thing to do, because it wins points with his friends who think of themselves as intellectuals on campus. They haven't looked it up either. None of them has looked it up. They'll tell you, what about Richard Dawkins? The answer is, yeah, what about Richard Dawkins? What did he say that moved you so? What did he say that convinced you so? 9 times out of 10, they will have just a blank stare in response. They haven't read what he said. They know his name. And they expect a religious person to just roll over and die when they hear the name Richard Dawkins. If you ask them, well, what did he say? And if they happen to remember something that he said, usually with your own intelligence, you can figure out what's wrong with it. And if you can't, just say, that's very interesting. I'm glad you shared that with me. You know what? I'll get back to you. And then write to one of us. We'll tell you what's wrong with it. It's just, it's hopeless from the outset. And not only we say so, but other secular philosophers say so. Like I said, just show you the reviews of his work, which are just damning, utterly damning, by atheist philosophers. So I would put the burden of proof on him. He's convinced. Say to him, I think you're an intelligent person, you're a thoughtful person, you're not a person who just jumps without reason. I'd like to hear your reasons.
Does the human psychology need to feel like they know where they came from? Is this like because I guess in my mind like the theory of evolution, like it's this idea of this is where we came from, but it seems like it's also an ability to have like free choice of, is there like God's either where we came from or evolution is where we came from? Is because no, it doesn't seem like anyone either doesn't believe that, like everyone believes that they came from somewhere. Does human psychology need that? And I'm trying to figure out.
Well, I think I think you're putting it well. I think you're putting your finger on something. Other people have talked about this. Let me put your question from the other angle. Why is there so much interest in where we came from? So what? Who needs it? I need to know how the market's going to behave in the next 6 months. What do I care who invented it 200 years ago? What's it got to do with me? It's not practical for my life. And yes, we do. All ancient religions, I haven't studied all of them, but many of them, have creation myths or origin myths. Where did the world come from? Where did mankind come from? One could have asked, what's the reason for the interest? Will that help you plant your crops? Will that help you win the next battle? Who needs it? And yet there is this fascination of where we came from. Now, part of the reason I think is, if you know where you came from, you know a lot about what you are. If you came into existence through evolution, then you are a slightly smarter squirrel. A slightly smarter squirrel, and that's all you are. If you are God's creation, you are a very different thing. So the interest in where I came from is in part the interest in knowing what I am. Presumably, if I know what I am, that will improve my life. I won't try to do things that are impossible for me, and I will be able to choose things which are within my nature, my character, to do. So, funny that you mentioned free choice, many of the believers in evolution on those grounds deny that we have free choice. Orangutans don't have free choice. Mice don't have free choice. And we're just another animal. We're just another animal. A friend of mine, Mordechai Becher, his wife was working on a doctorate at the University of Toronto in animal psychology. And in their papers, they were required to write non-human animal participants and human animal participants. But everyone had to be labeled an animal, including the humans, because humans are just another kind of animal. If you didn't write that, you couldn't get your degree. That's, unfettered inquiry. Politics in university. So, evolution is often given as an excuse for there not being free will. At any rate, the bottom line is, yes, we're interested in origins because it says something about what we are, what can be expected of us, and Darwinism has been used and is continually used to a great deal subconsciously and even to a certain extent explicitly as an excuse for low standards for behavior. After all, I am an animal. I'm just an animal. I'm a smarter animal. By the way, I saw a book of essays by Rav Shach, which was translated into English. I just glanced at it. I didn't have the time to go through the whole thing. I opened randomly to a page. And on that page he says, don't think that the fact that human beings have greater intellectual ability or aesthetic ability than the rest means that people will have to admit that we are special and different from other things in nature. Every species has something that it does better than other things do. Eagles see better than other things do, and cheetahs run faster than everything else. And human beings think better than other things. That doesn't mean we're not animals in their eyes. We're just animals with this particular capacity as against other animals with other capacities. And he's 100% right. I don't think he reads evolutionary literature. I don't think he read it, but that's exactly how they treat us. So I think the fascination with origins is a result of the fascination with trying to figure out who we are, and it has big consequences for that reason.
So does the theory of evolution give that free choice of creation or coming from somewhere else? Because what would people believe if they didn't have the theory of evolution?
Okay, I wouldn't say free choice. I think that has associations which are unfortunate in this context, but you're right. Richard Dawkins, one of his remarks, which I think does express a certain truth, by accident, says that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually satisfied atheist. Those words are making exactly your point. If we don't have an explanation for where life came from, and to say that you're an atheist, and you have the whole of life in front of you that you can't explain, probably makes you feel a little uncomfortable. Where did all this stuff come from if it didn't come from God? But now he says that we have an explanation where it came from. We don't need God. You can be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. That's what he says. So I think you're right. Many people use this as their way out. And that's one of the reasons why they trumpet it and they don't tolerate any questioning of it, and they pretend that it's known for sure when there's endless material against it. Endless material against it. Having mentioned this, I want to share with you an observation. This was made, the idea and theory was made many times, and the most recent was by Thomas Nagel in a book called Mind and Cosmos, which the evolution people just rant over it. They rant over it. They say personally insulting things across the board. I mean, it's just, he could put them intellectually into a thimble. I'll tell you what he says, and then I'll tell you my way of putting it, which is very, I think, simple and intuitive. So you can use him as the authority, and you can use my way of expressing it. He says that evolution says that the whole of life is due to a process that's undirected, uncontrolled, unmanaged, accidental. What evidence do we have that the probability of it happening that way is big enough to take seriously? What evidence do we have that the probability of it happening that way is anything other than so trivially small that you can't take it seriously? Now, many have made this challenge. No one, no evolutionary biologist, no philosopher of science has ever even tried to answer that challenge. Show me the evidence that the probability of what you say happening is other than negligible. Show me the evidence. No one's even tried to do that. Now, to drive home the point, let me give you a way of illustrating it. I have an object, and on one side of the object, I have painted an X. And I threw the object into the air 3 times in a row, and 3 times in a row it came down and landed on the X. By accident. By accident. I didn't throw it in any special way. It's not weighted. It's not magnetized. It doesn't have ridges to catch the air, so it floats down in a certain way. I threw it into the air, and 3 times in a row, it came down on the X by accident. Do you believe me or not? Say again?
Why not?
Why not? Why not? After all, what's the probability of that happening? If you thought it was a coin, probability would be 1 in 8. That happens 12.5% of the time. That's often enough to believe that it happened. But I didn't tell you what the object was, did I? I said I had an object. I didn't tell you how many sides it has. Suppose it turns out this is an object with 1,000 sides. Surely you got 1,000 sides. And I tell you, I painted X on 1 out of the 1,000 sides, and I threw it into the air 3 times. 3 times in a row it landed on the same side, the X side, by accident. Would you believe that now? The chances are 1 in a billion. An American billion, 9 zeros. Not a British billion, which has 12 zeros. They just, cavalier with their zeros. Right? I don't think so. 1 in a billion chance should happen only if you flip the thing, about 3 billion times. Right? Not the first time, the only time you did it. But now I didn't tell you how many sides it has. Suppose I refuse to tell you how many sides it has. blank. Do you believe me or disbelieve me when I say I threw it into the air 3 times and it landed on the X by accident 3 times? What should your reaction be? I think your reaction should be, you haven't given me enough evidence to make up my mind. In a case like this, to believe or disbelieve depends crucially on the probability. If you don't tell me the probability, it's not rational for me to make up my mind. What I should say is, I don't know whether to believe you or not. That's correct. That is exactly what you should say. I don't know whether to believe you or not. Well, you're telling me that life is due to evolution. And you are not able to give me the probability that evolution will produce life. I think we should have the same attitude. You haven't given me enough reason to make up my mind whether what you say is acceptable or unacceptable. I need evidence that supports what the probability is. If you can't use evidence to support what the probability is, you can't show that it's greater than negligible, then you have given me no reason to accept it. True, I don't have a solid reason to reject it. That's true, but that's not the only other alternative. The other alternative is just to be neutral and say, I don't know, and by the way, you don't know either. You're just fooling yourself and trying to fool other people if you say you know it's true, because you haven't got any evidence that the probability is anything other than negligible. So I think that I've tried this out and I've challenged students, write to your biology professors and your philosophers and all the rest, and get me an answer to this. No answers. And I know there's no answer because nobody's answered Nagel either. No one has said, sure, look at this book and this book and this book, and you see the probability is 0.365. No, there isn't such thing. Now, why is there no such thing? Well, the process, as you've probably heard, is that there's something that makes copies of itself, and then it gets interfered with, and the copies aren't exact. Sometimes the copies are better. There are mutations, the DNA changes, and it gets more productive, and so forth and so on. You're talking about millions of changes over billions of years. That's their story. The probability of all of them happening means that you've got to track the environment of those billions of years and track the molecules that are guiding the reproduction over those years and form some estimate how concentrated were the cosmic rays that cause mutations. What about pollutants or chemicals in the water which cause mutations, and so forth and so on. It's hopeless. It's hopeless to get a probability for that process. Now, some people try to a phony way out. You're asking for something that's impossible. Isn't it unreasonable to ask for something that's impossible? No. It's not unreasonable to ask for something that's impossible. If I ask for something, you tell me it's impossible, then you have to suffer the consequences of its not being there. You can't defend yourself by saying it's impossible, so I shouldn't have to produce it. If it's really impossible, then you lose. Imagine a person who's being tried for a crime, and there's no evidence. And the prosecutor says, you know why? Because he has the hold of the mafia behind him, and they're very good at hiding evidence. They're so good that we'll never find the evidence. Can you convict him on those grounds? I don't think so. To convict him, you have to have evidence. And if the mafia's behind him, and they're so good at hiding the evidence, you'll never find any, then he can't go to jail. You don't say, because it's impossible, I don't need it, he should go to jail. That's crazy. You can't send a person to jail without evidence. You can't convince me that a theory is true unless you have evidence. In this case, what I need is evidence of its probability. And you don't have it. Another example that I give, you come to a shooting range and you see a target, and there are like 6 holes in the target. And you ask the fellow running the shooting range, how did those holes get made in the target? I'll tell you how. See this gun? Now you see it's on a pivot, it's on a tripod, and it's on a pivot, and it swings around. And as you see here, we have a spring, and the spring gives it a push, and it goes around and around and around. And then we have a random mechanism in the gun which fires off at random intervals. And there are 6 holes in the target, because the first 6 bullets that it shot all went into the target. Are you convinced? I wouldn't be convinced. It's going around and around and around, and it puts 6 holes straight in the target? That's just not reasonable. Could it happen? Yeah, it could happen, but probability is much too low. It's much too low. So now you see the gun on the pivot, and you say, how does it work? I say, well, it's a secret. It's a secret how it works. But I tell you, the first 6 bullets that it shot went into the target. I think you should say, if you're going to keep it secret how it works, then I don't know whether to trust you or not. Because if it's swinging around like that, then it can't be right. Somebody else snuck up when you weren't looking and put the bullets in the holes in the target. And if it's this expert marksman who sets it and aims it at the target, then I'm happy to accept it. You don't tell me, I can't make up my mind whether to trust you or not. And that's the situation that evolution is in. This is simple. This is straightforward. It's pure logic. I happen to be a logician, so I like these sorts of things. I have material problems with evolution as well, but this already, I think, demotes it from an intellectual requirement to accept it as true to something that could be true, and if you can earn your living by researching it, it's a free world. Go ahead and research it, but don't sell it to me that I'm intellectually bound to accept it as true. It's just not correct. Yeah.
Now leading up to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, what is the best kind of things that we can do in order to gain favor in Hashem time?
The best thing that you can do is what he told us to do. You can't outsmart God.
So what did he tell us?
He told us to do tshuva. Now, tshuva is a long story. I will talk about it next week in Yitz Hashem. But roughly, tshuva has 3 parts. One is to regret what one has done in the past. That means to try to put aside the rationalizations and the hopes and the fears and the explanations and all the excuses that we have. To look it square in the face and say, yes, what I did was wrong. It's inappropriate. To resolve to change. To resolve to change. And in resolving to change is included in trying to create practical strategies for changing. I stress the word resolve because some people think that it only works if it's in fact successful in the end. That's not correct. If you have a sincere resolve to change, even if you're not able to maintain it, it counts. It counts as valid for Yom Kippur, and it gets a person forgiveness for what he's done in the past. It starts with a new slate. But it can't be just lip service. It's got to be a real resolve to change. And one has to confess these things to God. One has to go through the process of addressing God and confessing, which is written in the Yom Kippur prayer book in detail. Actually, there's in the Sephardi versions of the Siddur, which includes the Hasidim, there's a confession almost every day, so we do this very, very often. It needs to be verbalized, and not just verbalized for psychological acuity. It's because it's a gesture in a relationship. The word tshuva, anybody know what the word tshuva means? Return. So now, here you have a little tricky idea. Return means I used to be somewhere, and I've become distant from that place, and I have to get back. Where did I used to be? I used to be in a certain type of relationship with God, and because of my mistakes, I have distanced myself from God. And now, tshuva means I have to take steps to get back. But there's a kind of, how shall I say this? There's an implication, taking one other thing into account, which means that you have to modify it, at least in practical terms, a little bit. My Rabbi Zatzal, the Boston Rabbi, with whom I was associated for 47 years until his death, said, let's see. I used to be here, made a mistake, and I fell away from here. Now I have to get back. Where are we going to go back to? I'm going to go back to here, the same place that I fell from. That's where I want to go back to. Isn't that risky? Isn't that risky? That's where I fell from. Wouldn't it be smart to take some extra precautions? And indeed, that is what is recommended. That when you work on a strategy for doing tshuva, it's not only to recover the lost closeness, but to try to protect oneself from the next fall. And this, for example, is related to an interesting discussion that you have in the poskim. And Yom Kippur, you have a list of things that went wrong. Let's say you confess on Yom Kippur and you do tshuva, you resolve, and you are successful, and you don't go back to it. You never go back to it. Next Yom Kippur, should you mention that problem that you solved last Yom Kippur and didn't repeat? Should you mention it again or not? So there are two views in the literature. A number of reasons are given, but one for each side, one way to look at it is this. The one who says don't repeat it next year is because if you repeat it next year, it's as if you're not convinced that God really forgave you. And that's terrible. We're guaranteed that if we do tshuva, God will forgive us. So don't express anything which would influence a sense of doubt as to whether, or worries as to whether one has been forgiven. The other one says, yes, you did tshuva last year and you confessed it and you were forgiven for it, but there was a time in your life when you failed at this, and it's good to be reminded of that from time to time so that you will continue to take precautions. Remember, 3 years ago, you failed at this. So don't let your guard down. Don't take for granted that it's beaten and that it's over. The Talmud says, the greater a person is, the greater is his evil inclination. It's an essay by Rav Chaim Shmulevitz, but very few people know it. We say, the greater a person is, the greater is his evil inclination. So he asks, does that mean, if I have two people, Reuven and Shimon, Shimon is twice as holy, twice as righteous as Reuven, so his evil inclination is twice as big? Is it proportional? Or could it be disproportional? Could it be that Shimon is twice as righteous and twice as holy as Reuven, but his evil inclination is 4 times as big? Could that happen? Must it be proportional or not? The Chaim Shmulevitz said there's an incident in the Talmud which proves that it can be disproportional. Now I'm making a prediction for you, a little bit of prophecy. Ask this question of people with black hats and lined black velvet yarmulkes and so on and so on. Could it be disproportional or not? And where is there a proof from the Talmud? The proof is from a very well-known story in the Talmud. I also knew the story before I read the essay, but I didn't draw the conclusion. Yeah, the story is this. Abaye saw a man and a woman, unmarried, set off on a journey. They thought to themselves, they're going on this journey, they're not married to one another. That's a compromising situation. He decided to follow them and to see what would happen. They traveled for several hours until they came to a fork in the road, and the man went one way, the woman went the other way, and parted company, innocently, without any failure. And Abai said, if I had been in his shoes, I would not have succeeded. I would have failed. And from this, the Talmud says, you see, the greater a person is, the greater is his evil inclination. Okay, now let's do a little calculation. This guy, this unnamed guy who went on the trip, succeeded. He succeeded. Now let's say Abai is 10 times as righteous as he is, and imagine that Abai's evil inclination is also 10 times as big as that guy. Then the prediction should be that Abai will succeed also. Because this guy succeeded, you multiply everything by 10, you have the same relationship, same interaction, and he should succeed. No, Abai said I would fail. So that means what Abai is saying, no matter how much more righteous I am than him, my evil inclination is even more evil. Not proportionally evil, but disproportionately evil, and I would have failed. From this, Rabbi Chaim Shmulevitz says that when a person becomes greater, and yet the evil inclination also becomes greater, it doesn't have to be strictly proportional to how much greater he becomes. It does not have to be that way. That's Rabbi Chaim Shmulevitz. His essays are translated in English. I recommend them. They're short, they're clear, they're to the point, and everything he says is proved by a statement in the Talmud or a statement of Rishonim straight. And they're not difficult. They're not, some commentaries are difficult. They're complicated and subtle. He just takes a very important issue and he writes 4, 5, 6 pages and nails it for you. But at any rate, that's the idea. The idea is to do tshuva. That's the theme of this period of time. And if one succeeds in doing tshuva, one will find pleasure in God's eyes.